Start.
Okay.
Did you hear that?
Good. Okay. Welcome, everybody. We are going to be talking about season extension tonight, how to keep crops growing into the winter months, extend the growing season, and even some things about starting, other ways to extend the growing season early in the spring. We have one of our farmers and market manager here with us today, who's going to be teaching the class, Miss Molly Hubble. So I'm going to duck out. I'm not feeling so well today, but Molly's going to take it over. And if you just give her a warm digital welcome, and we'll take it from there.
Hello, everybody. Bear with me while I figure out how to get this presentation going. Keto, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep,
cool.
just bring it back to the first slide and then you'll be good.
Bring it back. Oh, there it is. Awesome. Thanks for bearing with me. Cool. So, hello, everybody. What a timely class. I feel like this is exactly the time where we should be talking about putting those, those last couple of rounds of crops into the ground for either a late fall or winter harvest. So I'm happy that you all are here and interested in this topic. This is something that I end up talking about a lot, especially in my role as support for market gardeners. Anything we can do to help folks growing food, either for sale or for your own consumption, to kind of spread out or expand the time period where you have crops available, either into the early spring or later into the fall and winter, is a benefit to everybody. So, and of course, like, it's a tricky thing, right? Most folks are used to planting everything around Mother's Day, and it's kind of this like one and done, like my tomatoes go in, they grow until they're dead, and that's the end of the season, which actually is a fairly short season. To only be planting between, May and, or to have produce available May through September, or maybe into a little bit of October, that's pretty short. But with, some tricks and some strategic, crop selection and planning, you can add a good couple of months onto either end of your season, and either have, food available for yourself or for sale. So I love talking about this topic. And as we get going, I am keeping my eye on the chat box to the best of my ability. I apologize if I neglect the chat box at some point. I get kind of chatty, but if you have a question, and I'm still in the middle of my spiel, write it in the chat box, and periodically I'll come down and check and make sure that we're answering those questions. And also, if I really get going, feel free to unmute yourself and just say hey, had that question, do you mind taking a minute? But I'll try and, add pauses in so you guys have all your questions answered, because I'm sure you have a lot of them. And actually, to start, I just got a question about what structure is behind me, or that I am sitting in. This is my backyard. And I am in my high tunnel. A high tunnel is an unheated greenhouse. Just start, I guess, with that kind of fun fact. If I were to add supplemental heating to this, it would turn into a greenhouse. And if you take that supplemental heating away, it's a high tunnel. It's a cultural term that describes a growing environment. So this is a high tunnel, and I got it from Rimmel. And the specific package is called the Nor'easter. I've had it for, I think, 3 or 4 years now. And I grow all sorts of stuff in it so that I can extend my growing season. Perfect. Okie doke. So let's get rolling. Okay. So what is the point? Why are we talking about this at all? Well, we're talking about this, I actually kind of already said this, with the use of season extension, you're able to expand your growing season, And by expanding your growing season, you're able to, according to Elliot Coleman, um, uh, make like even more waves in your local food system by growing more food in the times when people like tend to need or be looking for it. So if you have, you know, more greens, more like stuff growing out of the ground, healthy stuff later into the fall and winter, and conversely, on the other side of the season, not only are you putting more food into the local food system, but you're also kind of encouraging and promoting healthfulness in the community over a longer period of time. Um, so yeah, supplying fresh, local, healthy, sustainably grown food in the winter. I feel like we should all be thinking more and more about how we can do that in our own, on our own scale, and in our own spaces. Um, and this is an excellent slide. I feel like I'm still kind of digesting the slide myself. Um, but yeah, let's this is John Birnbaum, Michigan State University, created this slide or this kind of web map. These are all the things involved with season extension, year-round farming. So in order to end with, you know, perpetual produce, it takes good placement, the P's, good placement, protection, so some sort of cover, preservation, some way of making sure that those crops that are grown in the shoulder seasons, once they're harvested, are like, you know, stored well, taken care of. Participation, big deal. It takes a lot of people to, you know, it takes a lot of people during the normal season, but if you're going to be expanding your season in either direction, it takes more labor, it takes more time. Planning for sure, and we're going to talk about succession planning and planting later on in the presentation. It definitely takes, like, you know, you can't really wing it. There's some math involved, but we'll talk about the math involved in a little bit. Process, so additional processes. If you're doing succession planning, you've got to think about turning beds over, improving soils more than just once a year. You've got to think about it in, you know, at multiple points throughout the season. So process is important, and placement. So that's more about like, does this area in my backyard, or does this space, or does my farm lend itself to season extension? Yes or no? So like thinking about the whole environment where you want to be growing through the winter or even earlier in the spring. So they're all the things you should consider, and are all a part of working towards perpetual production. So I hope that's clear. You will all get a copy of this presentation at the end so that, you know, and I'll probably do the same. I'll probably kind of digest this a little bit as well. So, but these are all the things to consider. It looks like a lot, and it is, but it's also totally doable. I promise. That looks overwhelming. It's not super overwhelming. Okay, so when I say season extension, what do I mean? So by definition, it is anything that allows a crop to be cultivated beyond its normal outdoor growing season. And when we're talking about, I'll get to that in a minute. Well, when we're talking about primarily like growing in the colder months, you know, on either side of the season, we're really talking about manipulating heat, heat and kind of like planting schedule. We're going to talk about the importance of light. But yeah, controlling the flow of heat is critical to extending your season. That's the big one right there. The advantages of season extension, we kind of already talked about this, but in general, higher yields, you know, more months of growing. I agree with this. Retention of old customers for sure. I found as a market gardener myself that if you have, for example, it's part of my whole flow here at my home farm, our tomatoes that you see behind me will produce through Thanksgiving, and sometimes, into December. I think last year we harvested the last of our green tomatoes. I can't believe this, but the second week in December. So typically people have green tomatoes and like love them and look forward to them in like late June, July, around 4th of July. To have them in the second week in December is different, and also means that you're in this area specifically one of the few that probably does have them locally. So it's a good idea if you're going to be a market gardener to think about season extension. And also extending employment for workers. So instead of, hiring people April through, you know, October, September, that means more, length of employment for local farm help, which is excellent. Disadvantages. I had to work outside, or I chose to work outside in my high tunnel and had plenty of produce to sell in December. So I will personally count that as a pro, but technically it does mean that break you get, from all that like backbreaking work all season, that little break in like, between October and March starts to shorten. So I definitely feel that pressure. Sometimes I really look forward to having several months of downtime, but if you're extending your season, your winter vacation time, disappears sometimes. Higher production costs, we're going to talk about that. If you have to add something like supplemental heat, we'll talk about pros and cons of supplemental lighting. But for example, like adding a structure like this, there's a cost involved. So increased production costs, and increased management demands. I like to say that having this high tunnel was like adding a really expensive pet to my household. It's something that I'm out here every day, either myself or my other half is out here every day, twice a day. It's almost like, you have to let the dog out, a couple times, 3 times a day. You have to come check on the high tunnel, open and close it, make sure everything's good. So increased management demands. So these are all things that you have to weigh out, pros and cons when you're thinking about extending your season. The three basic components of season extension. Number one, chief among them, is crop selection, specifically choosing those cold hardy vegetables that we already know can make it in the colder temperatures. Either they can germinate readily in cooler soils, or the plant material itself can tolerate lower temperatures and be just fine and still be marketable and be okay. And then number two is succession planting. So instead of this just kind of like one and done approach to planting, really putting time and effort into making some sort of planning document or like farm planning document, doing some math, and instead of just one planting, spacing it out. So doing multiple plantings of a single crop throughout a season. And that's a big shift for a lot of people. And I totally understand that. We'll talk about your resources for succession planting in a minute. And then thirdly, protected cultivation. So it's oftentimes not enough to just put it in the ground and hope that it survives the snow or like extended snow coverage, right? So we want to think that, adding some sort of cover, and they don't have to necessarily be fancy like a high tunnel, but you want to think about how you're going to protect what you're trying to grow in the shoulder seasons. Low tunnels, cold frames, high tunnels. There are all sorts of different, approaches to protected cultivation, but those are the three. So crop choice, good planning, succession plantings, and thinking about additional structures to help retain heat mostly. So growing in the winter. How do we grow in the winter in Michigan? um, yeah, so there are a couple, we're going to talk strategies. So number one comes down to crop choice. So plant cold tolerant crops. That's a basic. So if we want to start planting and growing in winter so that we can have a harvest in December, January, or March, we want to be strategic in our crop choices. So that largely means for us in Michigan that we are choosing things like leafy greens and rooting crops. These are kind of like tried and true crops that work in a variety of like covered spaces or protected spaces outside. I'm sure you could get wild with other crops, but these are just kind of like, like general recommendations. So leafy greens, rooting crops. Next rule here is you want to get them established before day lengths dip below 10 hours a day. And this is the big one, right? So apart from adding supplemental lighting, like if I were to add like grow lights in here or like LEDs or kind of get wild with it, unless you're going to do that, which bumps up your electricity bill, you really need to be planning around like all of your plantings around what's called the Persephone period, which is a period between roughly November 1st and I think it's like February 7th or 10th. So like that 3-month window there is when the day lengths here in Detroit dip below 10 hours a day of sunlight. And that's a really critical time. That means like if pretty much all plants or one of the ones that like we tend to plant for like human consumption need more than 10 hours of daylight in order to grow and leaf out and kind of like create more of themselves. You can establish plants up to that point, but they basically enter into this period of stasis. So for example, if you grew a kale up to be 10 inches by November 10th, it will, and if you keep it well protected and it's like nice and happy and warm, it just sits like that until the days start to lengthen again, and then it'll start to grow. But there's really, apart from adding supplemental lighting, there's really not a whole lot that you can do to tell that plant to like get bigger. You can keep it warm, but it will just kind of sit there. So day length is really important. So to that end, or knowing that, we use that period. So November 1st, and then we work backwards from November 1st to establish when our last plantings of the season would be. So for example, we know that most radishes, like the ones that you get in the garden resource program, are somewhere between 30 and 40 days, sometimes a little less, but roughly like 30, 40, 35 days, we'll say, to maturity. So from seed in the ground to having a finished radish that you can eat with some greens on top. Knowing that, what you would do if you wanted to plant radishes and then have them available and ready around November, is you would take that November 1 date and then you would work in front of it. So you would count 36 days, and it is a good idea to add a good week onto that. So let's say 45 days to radish from November 1st. And that's going to give you the very latest date where you could plant those in the ground and expect to get a radish by the time that day length hour, drops below 10 hours a day. I hope I made that clear. I think I have a handout that will help make that a little bit clearer. So that's like your hard end on that side of the season. I hope I made that clear. So November 1st. Okay, I feel like I've belabored a point, but the third one is add some protection. So it's not enough just to like put it in the ground, the right number of days before November 1st, and like planted nicely, watered and maintained. The other element that you're working against, in addition to like decreasing daylight hours, is that it's getting quite a bit colder, right? So as it gets colder, and harsher, right? Higher winds, sleet, uh, um, like those are all things that can damage plants, before we get, 2 feet of snow, right? Um, you want to add some sort of protection. So this could be as easy as mulching, um, or as fancy as adding a high tunnel to your farmer garden. We'll talk about options kind of at the end of this. And harvest. So established plants can be harvested during the colder months. Absolutely. I will say that it is a little bit more challenging to go out there when it's 10 degrees and harvest greens. Um, it's it's a whole different world, I will say. If you haven't, run outside to fill a wholesale order in December, it's a whole different thing. You gotta, get hot packs in your gloves. You gotta wear 40 layers. Um, so it's a whole situation. And it is worth noting that some, not all crops can actually handle, even with the addition of like good cover, really, really, really cold, prolonged cold temperatures, the likes that we usually see in late January and February. We'll get like that polar vortex will set in general. I found that even the cold hardy plants appreciate having like they can tolerate cold temps, lows, like numbers of days, like sustained lows. Um, Even the most cold hardy plants can take a hit. Cool. So let's talk about cold hardy vegetables. Gotcha. So said leafy greens, right? But that includes any cold. I want to plug Keo. Not a lot of people growing it, I feel like. Crops, beets, as I said, radish.
Your voice is going away.
Carrots are something.
Molly, we're having trouble hearing
If you have
you.
questions about that, let me know. Maybe salad greens are.
Molly, your voice is going away.
Oh. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
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 Is it coming in and out? There's a storm right over my head. So I might see if I can scoot here, because I don't think you're going to be able to see me. Okay, guys, I'm gonna go to a better location. I am not sure what's going on with this cloud. Give me 1 minute and then I'm gonna be right back. So take a 2-second break, be right back.
Can't hear anything. She'll be back.
Okay, how about now?
Perfect.
Yeah, much better.
Much better.
I'm sorry about that, you guys. Looks like I was getting a little interference. Now I'm in my living room. Okay, I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen. Okay, can you guys see the presentation again?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, so we were talking about cool season categories of crops. So as much as I would like to have tomatoes growing in my high tunnel all winter long, they would not be too happy. They would not be happy at all. In general, warm season crops, hot crops can't appreciate or don't appreciate temperatures under 50 degrees. So they are not an option, unfortunately, unless you have heaters running full time, all the time, and supplemental lighting. So we're really talking about leafy cooking greens, heading crops, root crops, and baby leaf salad greens. And I can tell you that the market for local baby leaf salad greens in December and January is something people should maybe consider. A lot of people looking for local stuff in January. All right, and now this is kind of the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about. So now we talk about like when to plant these things. What's an appropriate time? Like what to plant, like specific crops. When, surprisingly, you can still get away with putting them in the ground. And we can talk about specifics if you guys have any questions about like a specific crop. I'd be happy to answer questions. But so here is a example of, so on the left side, we have a whole list of crops. I'll explain the tiers in a minute, but well, I can do that now. So basically, in this chart, they've split different cold hardy crops into 3 categories. Tier 1 crops are like tried and true. Like we absolutely know that like you can plant them in the fall, late fall for a winter harvest. Like we know that they are solid over the winter or into the fall. Tier 2 is kind of like you might, depending on your growing situation and like how diligent you are and like how good your cover is, those guys, are like sometimes hit or miss, like a good thing to try, but like not as tried and true. And you'll see tier 3 are things that with a lot of help and support and like really good planning and maintenance will make it, but like they're a little bit less for the beginner and more for like an advanced growing situation. So in tier 1, we have kale, spinach, tatsoi, and then what we have additionally on this is not to start them as transplants. So to, put the seeds in a transplant and then that's what gets planted in out on these dates, or if you can direct sow them. So like next to kale, for example, if you were going to do, let's say like direct sown kale for like baby leaves, like little leaves that you were going to cut and put into salad mixes on their own, here you could plant them as late as September. Yeah, I agree with that. Now I'm looking at these dates, like, do I agree with these dates? I agree with these dates. So September, yeah, the first 2 weeks of September, they would need some cover, but that's a lot later than I feel like most folks are used to planting kale. I oftentimes get, people who are like, they're surprised that like you can actually plant that late. And if you have good cover for those crops, absolutely. Like that's how long your season can be. Spinach, even farther out than that, you can plant, end of September. in covered spaces, which is pretty cool. So that's how this chart reads, basically by crop, whether it's direct sown or transplanted. And then what happened here was Keto typed in our end date into a spreadsheet. I think this is Johnny Selected Seeds. If you go to their website, they actually have tools that you can use to calculate by crop your last planting date for certain things. And it's all based around that last, you can see it at the very last column, the last 10-hour day of the season. So for us, he plugged in November 1st, and then the website, or like the tool, populates for you your last planting dates for each crop. So it already knows days to maturity. It already knows, like all of that. And then it just gives you this really nice calendar. So of last planting dates. So that's pretty cool. We can probably include the link to this when we send out notes. So here's that tier 2. So these are ones that are like a little more kind of like, they need a little bit more love than, kale or spinach, which are like pretty hardy. So arugula, cress, and mizuna, these guys are a little bit more tender, like the leaves themselves are a little bit more tender. They need a little bit more frost protection than the others. That's why they're kind of in this tier 2. That's my take on it. But still, we're looking at, for your last planting dates under cover, late September, and even for some of these things, like first week in October, which is pretty incredible. And then tier 3, these things definitely need good cover, like good management, lots of fertility, and maybe slightly more care than some of the others. Carrots, Swiss chard for sure, lettuce, head lettuce. So these are even more tender, or something like carrots, which needs more management, like regular weeding, stuff like that. So we're looking at last planting dates of, and some of these things have already passed, right? So like early August, early to mid-August for carrots, and Swiss chard. I'm just looking because someone said, what can I still plant? So like we are, what is it, the 26th, I can't even remember, of August. So a lot of these things are still, there's still time to plant these things. Does anyone have questions about this specifically? If you want to unmute, I feel like this is like really like a very critical piece of the puzzle. Does anyone have specific questions about these crops?
Well, it says Swiss chard, and then it has baby Swiss chard. What does that mean?
Excellent question. Yeah. Yep. And this is something that market gardeners get used to the lingo here. So basically, if you wanted to grow Swiss chard, yep, and they did include the same kind of like the 2 entries, baby and mature leaf for kale, that's right, and for arugula, baby and kale, or baby and mature. So what they're doing is there are 2 different days to maturity for basically like 2 different ways to harvest the same crop. If you are harvesting Swiss chard to bunch, like with the big leaves and like the multicolored stalks, and that's how you want to sell it or use it as like a mature leaf, it takes longer for the plant to get to that period. So there's a days to maturity that corresponds to Swiss chard. It's more like 60 days, something like that. As opposed to baby leaf, if you wanted to cut it really small, like 4 to 6 inches, and put it in like a salad mix, that's going to be a really quick turnaround. And that difference means, so if you're going to plant Swiss chard for the full stock, you need to plant it earlier, right? So it has enough time to get to that size. But if you only want Swiss chard and it's like baby stage, you can wait and you can actually plant it even later in the season because it doesn't need as much time before you're going to harvest it. So that's all based around what version, I should say, of that crop you anticipate wanting to harvest. So that's why there are 2 dates instead of 1.
And related to that, are we talking transplants or seeds?
Gotcha. So if you look at the thing, there's a checkbox next to it. So for example, for the full head, sorry, you would, so if you wanted to transplant Swiss chard, you would be planting the transplant, if I'm reading this correctly, on the 10th. Let me make sure I'm reading this right. I am pretty sure, maybe it got cut off, that the green boxes correspond to when you're putting it in the ground, either as a transplant or as a direct sown. Pretty sure. I will look into this. So if you are going to put transplants in the ground for like the much larger leaves on, for example, 8/30, you would have started those 2 weeks prior in like little plant cells to be planted out. 99% sure that's what that means. I hope I made that clear.
Yeah, kind of, because see, I have the check boxes, but I don't see anything at the top that seed or transplant.
Oh, got it. Let me go. It's on. So what happened is these 2 slides have half. We cut a chart in half to fit it into the slides because it's a really big chart. So for example, if I go back the tier, you can see tier 1, and then you can see that I guess it does say start transplants.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. So we can attach this to the notes so that you can review it. But it is one full document with all the information on it. It's a little choppy like this. I agree.
Does this tot soy, is that the same as bok choy, or is bok choy not on this list?
See where it says tot soy is different, but you see where it says pak choy, PACCHOI. Pak choy, I have seen the 2 used interchangeably. Bok choy and pak. Basically, it's like that kind of watery, very like rigid stem with like the leaves, and it's white or green on the bottom or red on top. Yeah. Tot soy different. Tot soy, it almost like has like a flattened appearance to it. It looks like a rosette, whereas pak choy is like it's a little more upright like this.
So this is really the week to be planting it, if it's a transplant.
It is definitely a week. We are there.
I have seeds.
That's why I say. Well, let me get to the next slide here. So I want to say, yeah, this entry in tier 3, lettuce, Salanova, you could sub that out for, I'm trying to think of like things that, yeah, direct sowing. So if we look at the lettuce entry in tier 3, baby leaf lettuce, it's definitely not too late to plant lettuce. You want to think about cover for it, but so the very last date that you could plant out, with cover would be middle end of September for like salad mixes with lettuce or just lettuce in general. But that means that you can plant here starting today through that date. So you have a fair amount of time, a month basically, to plant. So you could actually plant a couple times. we're going to talk about succession planning in a second. Thank you, Patrice. Tatsoi, bok choy, pak choy are all types of Chinese cabbage, for sure. Okay. And this is super fancy. This might take some time to digest. But hoop house crop rotation. So now we're talking about planning. So that was kind of how do I figure out, you know, my absolute end to my planting windows if I'm not going to add supplemental light. And this is kind of more of a like, if you have a hoop house or a high tunnel, this is a strategy you can use. I think we also got this from John Birnbaum. This is a crop rotation that they used in their high tunnel, I'm pretty sure, where you're thinking about not just growing a single crop in a covered space, but thinking about all the seasons so that you have continuous harvest in a covered space. So for example, this is saying that their August plantings of scallions, carrots, kale, chard, collards, and parsley get rotated. So that portion of their covered environment, once it's harvested in April, turns into something else. It rotates and turns into tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers and the like. And then if they're going to be doing, and that's for fall plantings that can be held over the winter and harvested in April. And then the alternative is September plantings. Let me make sure that I'm seeing this clearly. That have maybe a shorter residency that gets swapped out in February. So depending on whether you want to harvest or plant in the fall and harvest in the winter, or plant in the fall and harvest in the early spring, that has an impact on what kind of cover you're going to put over your crops, if it's something that's for the short term, or if it's something that like really needs to get these plants through the dead of winter and can maybe withstand like being covered in ice and snow. So if there's anything to take out of it, it's that you need to know your strategy. Are you planting for like a December harvest and then you're done? Or are you planting in the fall for something that you're going to carry over the winter and is going to sit there over the winter? And then you're going to harvest it in the spring. So it's a lot of arrows and lists to basically say like, know your strategy when you plant in the fall. That's it. Here are some examples. I mean, we already kind of listed them out, but so leafy cooking greens, for sure. We already talked about chard and the different forms of chard, either baby leaf or, you know, full leaf, mature leaf chard. Spinach is very cold hardy. They can take light frosts. Chard gets a little temperamental. Kale can absolutely take light frosts. It will often come back from, you know, super low temperature and can revive itself. Heading greens, so we have pak choy on the list, of course, definitely head lettuce, cabbages like Napa cabbages, and then that's tatsoi down at the bottom right. So you can see examples of those. Root crop examples, radishes for sure. That's something that you can always squeeze more, you know, into your season. They are very quick to go in and come out. So it's one of the last things that you can plant along with like baby leaf lettuces, because they only need, you know, something like 30, 35 days, even less than that sometimes to mature. Turnips, salad turnips, carrots, they take a lot longer to mature. So those guys are again in that like tier 3, like, you know, a little bit more strategic planning and cover involved with having a long season of carrots. And then here's another example of some winter farmers. So maybe you guys recognize Jerry and Billy. This is Jerry Ann Hebron and Billy over at Oakland Ave Farm. Here in the North End, they're my neighbors. And this is their winter high tunnel, or I should say the winter version of their high tunnel over at the farm. So I don't know when this photo was taken, but based on the parkas and hats, this is definitely late fall, early winter. And those are radishes coming out of the ground, which is pretty cool. So radishes for sure are something that you can harvest later. We said baby leaf salad greens, absolutely, especially cut and come again type stuff. And here is a winter harvest example. And you can see a couple to point out in this photo. You can see that there is a good amount of snow mounted up against it.
Sorry.
Trinetta, you might want to mute.
Oh. Yeah, Trinetta, if you want to mute, unless
yeah.
you've got a question, a little bit. Thank you. So you can see in this photo that these guys are harvesting in their high tunnel. Two things to note. One is that there's a significant amount of snow mounted up against the side of that high tunnel, which tells me that this is probably January or so, January, February. Two, even though they're growing in a covered environment, you can see that they've added additional insulation around their plants with mulch. And some of that's probably weed suppression, if I had to guess, but also that's creating a little bit of insulation around the plants themselves. So helping to keep some of the heat in and around those plants. So mulching is also one of the strategies for keeping your plants warm and happy. So those two things to note here. So some winter, this is baby leaf salad mix. And we've got winter spinach. And I'll just take a step here and say that crop breeding has gotten to the point where not all spinach is created equal. So there isn't just like one kind of spinach seed, there are many. And they have been tailored by breeders for different kinds of growing environments. So for example, you can buy spinach seed that is heat tolerant or disease resistant, or also, which is relevant for this class, is very good in cold temperatures or in situations where there is lower light levels and all of that. So there are winter spinach varieties, fall spinach varieties, and spring or main season varieties too. So if you're really looking to like have a continuous supply of spinach, sometimes planting the same variety of spinach is going to give you different results over different seasons. But if you're a market gardener specifically, you might want to try and go for those that are bred to be overwintered or cold season crops. Usually means they can handle lower temperatures and very, very short days. Asian greens like Mizuna also on the list. This is a rosy red bok choy that's being grown for winter harvest. Warm season crops. I think this was included just as an example of things that don't like making it into the into the winter, but it does. For example, my hot season crops, the ones that I planted, you're gonna have a really hard time overwintering things like tomatoes or eggplant or peppers in a high tunnel. However, you can extend their season a bit on either side. So for an example, I start my transplants inside, my tomato transplants inside in February. And And then I plant them in my high tunnel under some row cover. So I put them in the ground in early March. I think this past season, it may have even been early April, which is way earlier than like Mother's Day, which is where a lot of people would, you know, like buy their tomatoes and put them out in their gardens, right? Which means that with the addition of the high tunnel, or even like a low tunnel, like a caterpillar hoop, that means that I'm getting an additional month or two of tomatoes at the beginning of the season and at the end of the season again. Like I still have some green tomatoes with me in December. So even though you can't really in my opinion, like overwinter a lot of these things, it does mean that you're getting a bigger window of harvest off of your warm season crops. So that's why that's included. Okay, any questions about that? I'm gonna look through real quick and see. Okay, otherwise I'm gonna keep rocking and rolling. So succession planting, and this is something that I am still figuring out myself. So when we say succession planting, we're talking about planting 2 or more different vegetables in the same garden space within one growing season. So for example, trying to think of like a really obvious example. So I think we all know that our garlic bulbs for next season's crop get planted somewhere around October, usually around Halloween, right? It's one of the last things we put in the ground. So the Garden Resource Program gives GRP members seed garlic. You know, we plant it at the very end of the season, we mulch it, and then it sits over winter, right? But so, however, like, it's not like that garden space is totally empty the whole season. So like if you have a raised bed and at the end of the season you're going to put garlic in it, you're not going to leave it completely empty all season. You're probably going to plant something like peppers or cucumbers or something like that before that, and then pull those out, go through, add compost, and then plant your garlic. That right there is an example of succession planting. So multiple crops being grown in the same space, like in the same season. Andrea, do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. You say that the 10 days hours ended by November. It is gonna be November and December, the months that are the darkest, right?
Yep. Through I think it's the first week in February. So November 1st through the first week in February, we have less than 10 hours of daylight per day. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Great question. That's that like very dark period, that period where plants really aren't, if they're in the ground and under cover, they're really not growing anymore. They're just in like they're in stasis. They're kind of like, if they're happy and, you know, watered and warm and everything, they're just gonna sit in that state. So that's like the amount of material that you get during that period. I hope that made that clear. Great question. So anyway, getting back to succession planting, that's like multiple crops, you know, being rotated out throughout a single season. So one crop after another. Here is a wild chart that kind of gives you an example of. So this is actually something that we've used in our crop planning class. This I have spent entire classes just kind of digesting with folks. This is an example planting plan for kind of a simple backyard garden. So what you can see on the bottom is that on the bottom part, they've mapped out their raised beds. So they've got 3 raised beds in their backyard, and they've split each raised bed into 4 sections. So, you know, bed area 1A, 1B. This is just like an overly simplified area, or overly like simplified kind of planting plan, but it's a really good plan. And it's a really great example of, so it's a little bit hard to see, but what they've done is they've taken their spaces, they've broken out their beds into multiple littler spaces. So they've split each bed into 4 sections. And then they've created an entry on top for what they're going to plant and when for each portion of their garden. So that there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of things coming in, you know, getting planted, getting harvested, and then something else is coming in right after it, to make use of that space. So for example, if I'm reading this in raised bed 1, section A, so like a portion of that first raised bed, in the same growing period or growing year, they're doing lettuce in the spring, and then they're gonna harvest that. And after lettuce, they're gonna harvest bush beans. And after that's out, they're gonna harvest spinach. And then instead of just having like one crop in that area per season, they've got 3 rotating through. It's all based around that, like, you know, absolute end date of November 1. And then also, like, on the other side, they're planting as early as the second week in April on the other side of it. So instead of 1 crop, now 3 crops rotated out. And this planting, this is actually, I call this like a planting matrix. This is basically the plan. So on top, you'll see like there's, you know, the weeks of the year and the months up top. I love having plans like this. We have one for KGD Farm. I have one for my own farm. So that when you get super busy, like we all are right now in our gardens, you don't have to think. You're like, oh, I just look at my plan and I know that, you know, spinach goes in, you know, the last week in August, right? Because in August, you know, my bandwidth shrinks and I can't remember some of this stuff. So having a good planting plan is pretty important. And then this really drives home the point that, like, even in small spaces, you know, a backyard garden with 3 raised beds, with a little good planning, you can get a lot more harvest out of these spaces. Moving crops in and then replacing them with other crops is a big part of the strategy. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, so we've talked about what kinds of crops, the absolute end of the season, right? When crops stop growing, November 1st. Now we're going to talk about how to keep them happy into the colder seasons and what that looks like in terms of structures. So a couple different things, you know, protected cultivation doesn't have to mean high tunnels. High tunnels are a huge investment, as I said earlier. There are a lot more cost-effective, like less labor-intensive ways of keeping crops happier longer into the cold season. For example, mulching, like we had that picture of, you know, they had a straw kind of packed in and around their plants. That'll give them a little bit of extra like warmth, you know, around them. That can protect. Cold frames, I have a picture of those. I once built a cold frame out of a bunch of windows that my neighbor was getting rid of. He took down all of his old windows off his house and put them on the curb. And then I grabbed them, painted them up, and then turned them into a cold frame. So like sometimes, you know, reclaimed materials like that can be turned into cold frames. Quick hoops, that's something that we have had whole classes on in the past. A quick hoop, I have some examples of that in a minute. Caterpillar tunnels, a little bit more of a thing, you know, something you would definitely have to like purchase and install. They're a little bit bigger. And then kind of like, you know, the end, not the end, but like the major investment would be a hoop house or high tunnel on your property. So these are all examples of protected cultivation. And here's a really, really basic diagram of a cold frame. So I built one of these myself. It's just a wooden box that sits, you know, on the ground. You don't have to line it. You can also plant directly into it. It doesn't have to be permanent. It can be something that you kind of like put together in the, you know, the early spring or the late fall. It can be broken down or moved. It's totally up to you. But what it is basically is it's a little box that's whole job is to like retain heat in and around your plants. It's important that the top is either a clear plastic or glass, so that what happens is you're just capturing the sun's rays during the day, which heats up the box. And that's kind of like the whole mechanism to it. You want to make sure the top is either removable or on hinges so that you can ventilate it. If it gets too hot, and you can cook your plants. But this is a good way of getting a couple additional weeks of, you know, heat around your plants in October and November. I've also seen people build their boxes instead of on wood on the sides. You can take bales of straw or hay and create like a box out of the straw bales around your plants, and then just put windows or plastic on top of that. And then just kind of like, you know, weigh it down. And then you can use that straw for mulch somewhere else when you're done using it. Like that's a pretty cost-effective way to build something like a cold frame as well. You want to make sure that it's in a place where, like, you know, it has southern exposure so that, you know, the box can capture the sun's heat. But that's cold frame. So here's a cold frame in action. Pretty simple. It looks like just plexiglass panels with some like wood, you know, to hold the heat in. And then you can see it kind of just barely, but they've actually put a little like an outdoor thermometer in there so that, you know, from the outside you can see how warm it is in there during the day. Here's some larger scale. I think these are, yeah, cold frames with their panels. Here's a really large scale cold frame, and you can see that since it's warm out that day, they have all the like glass panels propped up for ventilation. You know, again, when we're talking about labor involved with like season extension, it does mean that like on a hot day, you have to run out there and vent it so that you don't kill the plants or roast the plants. So, you know, pros and cons there, but you got to watch for it getting too hot. Same deal. Here's some cold frames made out of old windows. Hot tip, make sure that your cold frames work for you. If you have, I'm looking at this picture, if you have a bad back like I do not want to be working like that. That looks like it would kill my back. So build them in a way that's easy for you to maintain. You know, make sure they're tall enough, wide enough. They're not so deep that you can't reach into them. Just make sure that you're building something that you're going to want to go out and maintain and, like, you know, care for in the dead of winter. Because if it's really cold out and you've got to go like shovel snow off the cold frame, and the cold frame itself is also kind of a pain in the butt to work in, you're really not going to be motivated to go out there. So here's some greens living in a cold frame. Here's a cold frame. This is hard to see, but what's happened is there's a ton of snow on top of their cold frame, but where it's been exposed to the sunlight, that heat now that's being generated through, you know, this greenhouse effect, it's trapping the heat in there through the glass, is actually starting to kind of melt the snow off around it. So even though there's probably 3 feet of snow on the ground, that cold frame is creating a little micro environment where it's nice and warm. Quick hoops. So these are temporary structures. You usually take a 1/2-inch conduit and bend these hoops out of it. You can get 1/2-inch conduit at Home Depot or Lowe's. It's pretty inexpensive. And then you put that over, just like, you know, putting a tent up over your beds. You just kind of push them into the ground, and then you secure floating row cover over it. So you're making this like long, how do I want to put it? Like this long tunnel over your plants. And that will raise the temperature underneath it a good 5 to 7 degrees on a cold day. So that's a really cost-effective way of keeping a small area a little bit warmer into the fall. This person, I think, is using PVC. So you don't have to use 1/2-inch conduit. PVC you can also use, doesn't last as long, more prone to breaking. And then you can see they've bent these over the crops. And then you can see the row cover is going over, and then it'll be weighed down all along the length of the bed, so that you just have this long tent over your crops. I think a lot of you have probably seen this. And then this is a hot tip. So what they do just to add extra security is they put rope up and over the floating row cover, the fabric, just to really secure it down. And there it is, totally secured. You know, kind of looks like a sausage, I guess, with like, you know, a tie on one end, a tie on the other, and then weights all the way down. And this one is even harder to see, but this is a picture of, so if you're gonna have low tunnels way into the season, you want to, and if you want to overwinter anything, like here in Detroit in a low tunnel over the season, once we get into December, you want to add an additional layer of clear plastic over your floating row cover, to one, protect it, but two, to like make sure that it can handle any kind of like snowfall. It gives it extra rigidity. It also makes sure that it stays a little bit warmer in there. You know, it protects it against the elements. So this is actually a photo of a low tunnel that has both floating row cover and plastic over the top of it. And that's for like deep winter conditions. And I see, yeah, my row cover blows off all the time too, Marguerite. Securing it has been, I mean, that is the thing. This person is using sandbags, which is great. But I think you all, or a lot of you have probably experienced when you get a high wind and there's just a little bit of that row cover where the wind is able to get up underneath it, it'll take the whole thing off like a sail. So securing it is really important. So this person, there's a stake in the ground that it's tied to on either end, and then making sure that you have enough weight all the way down both sides is really, really important. And here is a super large scale version of this. So this tractor implement actually pulls a continuous row of plastic over these beds. And I wish I had like another view of this, but so the tractor drives over these beds, and the implement on the back of it simultaneously stretches plastic over those wires that they have, and plows kick soil over the edges of that plastic. So in one pass, they're able to cover all of the beds and secure all the plastic in one go. That is larger scale production agriculture for you. And there it is. So you can see that what they did was they just buried, like all the way down, they buried the edge of the plastic on all of those crops. And I don't actually know what's planted under those, but that seems pretty extreme. And here we go. The next tier would be something like a hoop house or a high tunnel. This one was constructed out of 1-inch electrical conduit and I think we might actually have the tool. There's a tool that you can get that will bend the conduit for you. You have to kind of like wrench it, but you can get a high tunnel bender that will put those specific like angled bends into 1-inch conduit. So it's good for like smaller high tunnel. If you want a smaller one for your backyard, 1-inch conduit will do it. If you want to get any bigger than that, this is a fairly small high tunnel. You know, it's 2x4s and like it's only probably, if I had to guess, like 20-25 feet long. You would want like thicker gauge metal, you know, to create the structure for it. But for small scale, this is totally doable. This is a rolling side. So this, the side of the high tunnel, you want to always make sure you can vent it. If it gets too hot in there, you're kind of defeating the purpose. You want it warm so that the plants are happy in the cooler seasons. But if it gets too hot, and this is my constant problem, you have to make sure you'll have the opposite problem. You have to go and vent the high tunnel. My high tunnel in April, when I plant out my tomatoes, if it's a sunny day in early April, late March, it'll be 110 degrees in there. If I have it completely closed up, 110 degrees in March. If I'm not careful, rolling up the sides, you know, with something like this, so rolling the sides up or venting the top of my structure, I'll just cook the plants and then I've defeated the purpose of the season extension, right? So that's something to consider when we're talking about management. Even with low tunnels, like quick hoops, or those little wire hoops, on a really hot day, you want to make sure that you're like getting fresh air in there. So like you've got to go out and make sure that you're like lifting it up and letting air flow through. And on a hot day, you've got to remove it. And then when it gets cold, you got to put it back. So things to consider. Here's a small high tunnel. This is an example of a caterpillar tunnel. So these guys are putting that up over crops that are already in the ground. Here's another example of a caterpillar tunnel. So it's not a huge structure. And also it doesn't have to be this long. With a caterpillar tunnel, you can see it's the same, same pieces of equipment. Just if you have, you know, 20 of them, as opposed to 4 of them, that dictates the length of it. So you can kind of tailor it to the size of your garden. And then we have high tunnels. So these guys are built, they're large structures built to withstand the elements and in general, a lot of snowfall. So they're made with like a much thicker gauge steel. They're a lot taller. They're definitely more expensive. But also there's a lot that you can do inside an environment like this. So you can see that in an unheated structure on the right, so that's a high tunnel where they, in addition to having things growing in a high tunnel, they've also covered up their crops with floating row cover. So the high tunnel gives you 7 to 5 degrees plus the 3 to 5 degrees that you're getting in terms of like additional heat protection with the floating row cover. So it's like they've doubled up on the levels of protection, heat retention that those plants are getting. So that's a twofer right there. Maintaining the temperatures. You always want to make sure that you're watching temperatures because again, it'll get too hot very quickly. Here's a hoop house built from a purchased kit. Mine was also a purchased kit, so I built an entire hoop house package through the NRCS equip program. Of course, Keto isn't here, but he and I both can help members of the Garden Resource Program apply for season, this is not a shameless plug, but I guess just a plug. He and I both can help people sign up for or apply for the NRCS seasonal high tunnel grant program. So if you have questions about that, technically Keto is your main contact for that program, if you're interested. More examples of high tunnels with crops underneath them. I feel like we've seen a bunch of these. This is winter spinach that went in a high tunnel. And as I'm going through pictures, does anyone have any questions?
Molly, I had a bit of a question. I was wondering what would probably be the best cost efficient route for like my backyard setup. I have about 4 foot by 8 foot raised beds, and I would love to be able to kind of like keep it warm. Do you think I should cover each individual or kind of like cover that entire space? And then
What? I would encourage you to give yourself max flexibility. And so here's my thinking. It's like getting used to season extension. It's a learning curve, and you want to give yourself max flexibility. And also, I don't want to ever tell people that like their investment has to be like this high in order to like get in the game. I really think that like starting small with like really cost effective or like simple measures sometimes is the best way to like gauge like whether it works for you or not. So before you jump straight, into like high tunnel for the entire covered space, which basically means that whole environment now you want to dedicate to like that kind of growing, I would give yourself the flexibility. And what I've done is I've taken like 1/2-inch conduit, and I've made, so if you have 8 foot raised beds, 8 foot by 4 foot, something like that, right? I would maybe install instead permanent like low tunnels. So like bend conduit over it. And maybe only on a couple beds, maybe half of it. And then play around with using row cover and maybe sheet plastic over a couple beds. So the row cover is going to give you a couple extra weeks in either direction. The plastic will give you an additional week or 2 in either direction. And then you get to kind of play around with it and see if like that works for you. And if you ultimately decide to go with like a high tunnel, you can always repurpose those materials over those beds. Like you saw that one high tunnel picture where they had, they were in a high tunnel, but they also had the beds covered with row cover. That way you're not like, you've made an investment, but even if you get a high tunnel, those materials can still be used down the road. You know what I mean? So that's where I would start. I would put some low tunnels over your raised beds.
What gauge of plastic, what thickness would you use to put over your low tunnels?
Gotcha. I would use the thickest stuff you can find. I found that like the 3 mil poly, that stuff, like it's the stuff that you typically buy when you're like, painting the walls in your house. It's like that like thin drop cloth type stuff. It kind of feels like a trash bag. That stuff, I tend to rip all the time. So I would say like 5 mil is really nice. It's pretty sturdy. Something that feels at least like a contractor bag, and make sure that it's also the clear plastic, obviously. But yeah, I would go with the sturdiest stuff you can. It's just gonna last that much longer. That's a great question. What other
I was
questions?
wondering, Molly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. How much space would you normally like put between like that PVC? I mean, or like, you know what I mean, like that conduit that you were talking about. Like, how much space in between the like? Do I allow walking space?
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering how that like.
Yeah,
You know what I
absolutely.
mean? Like how to space it so that way we can still kind of work around it and it's not very awkward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So I think even on like the Johnny's website, they recommend something like 3, no more than 4 feet in between the low tunnels, so the half conduit hoops. And that is so that you don't like end up with this like dip. So like once you cover it, there's like this like sag between them. If you space them too far apart, the row cover or plastic will sag, and then it'll just catch snow. It'll catch, all sorts of stuff. So you want them
Water and
in
stuff,
this
yeah.
sweet spot of like 3, no more than 4 feet apart. So that'll give enough structure to the floating row cover, enough support to the floating row cover. So if you had an 8-foot raised bed, I would say no less than 3 hoops. So like 1 on either end and 1 in the middle would be like the bare minimum, but I might even encourage you to do 4. So like 1 on either end and 2, at halfway points. But you could get away with 3.
Gotcha.
Yep.
And for like smaller ones, I mean, so what's the do we really just kind of like press that into the ground? Because I've kind of cardboarded and like mulched over some of those spaces. So like should I like use a shovel to kind of like dig a nice hole in there, or like what's the I know this is probably like too detailed, but I'm just kind of wondering.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. So one thing I have done is I actually, because I knew that I wanted them there for a long time, I put hoops over a nursery bed of mine, and they're semi-permanent. I actually just like took a piece of wood and I screwed them right to the side of the what would be the raised bed. So I took the hoops, and instead of putting them into the ground, I actually like basically screwed them to the sides of the raised bed. And then during the summer, I used them as trellising. So like, for example, peppers and cut flowers grew up through it. And I used those hoops to secure things like trellis netting, to, like keep my peppers upright. So,
That's super
right. So like, there you go. There you go. Like install it, make it work for you.
So like you can find those things at like Home Depot and Lowe's and stuff like that, because I'm just wondering what would be like the best route to kind of like what's like the best route for materials, or is it more of like a hardware store?
Got it. So yeah, I mean, you can call hardware stores. I know that half inch conduit. It's like a couple bucks per. Home Depot sells them in 10 bundles of 10, and I think they're 10 feet long. So you can get them for Home Depot, and they're pretty cheap. And if you get the galvanized ones, they last basically forever. So, it's a very cost-effective way. And then floating row cover is something that you can buy online. I know Johnny Selected Seeds, or actually Nolts, Nolts, Nolts Greenhouse Supply online, also sells floating row cover.
I had a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned grant writing for materials. Can you elaborate a little? I'm looking not just to get some raised beds for community garden, but some fencing, because we've had dogs and people wandering through the plots. So we want to be able to keep them out.
Yeah.
Would the grants cover that too?
No, so this is a really specific grant. So it's a National Resources Conservation Service grant program. It's a national grant program. And it is specifically for growers that are interested in extending their season. So super relevant to this class. So the funding that you would apply for is to cover the purchase of a new high tunnel kit. And it boils down to the number of square footage. So they give you, so you can only buy that if that it's an application just for that one thing. You can't then buy additional stuff with it.
Okay.
Yep, exactly. So it's very specific to high tunnels and only new high tunnels. So like you wouldn't get money to buy one off of Craigslist, for example. You would have to go to a high tunnel company. Believe me, like I asked that question. I was able to get my high tunnel through this grant 3 or 4 years ago, something like that. So I can really speak to, and so can Keto, obviously, and actually a fair number of people on this call, now that I look at it, to what that program is all about. But if you do have more specific questions, if that does sound like something that you'd be interested in having on your farm or garden, he's not here to defend himself. So I'm going to say send Keto an email, keto@keepgrowingdetroit.org, and just make sure you reference the seasonal high tunnel grant through NRCS.
Okay. Because I would like to do that, get a high tower, and it would be new because I'm fairly new with this garden, community garden. And but like I said, we've had some issues, trying to get established. But the raised beds are one thing. He's been doing it in the ground. It's been too difficult. But I'm trying to invest in some raised beds. So I was looking, Romando, he gave me some resources and I've checked out a few of them, for what we're looking for. Right now, all I'm doing is waiting out the season and prepping it for the spring. Hopefully we can have it in place for the spring. But if I can
that's
get
a great idea.
Yeah, because I'm working with someone else and he'd already started growing. So I said, well, when the season ends, then we could, start with a new plan and get, the fencing in and, the raised beds before the winter. So if you could have any ideas, like the cold tunnel, that would be something we could invest in. But if you have any other possible sources I could use, put them in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, I might have to think on that for a minute. And maybe Keto and I can think about that. Yeah, I'm sorry that it isn't a more flexible granting program, really. It's not everybody is.
But like I said, most of the things, most of the things Romando gave me were one particular. Well, one was just in fruit trees. Well, that's not exactly what I'm into right now.
You're not into fruit trees?
If you have any, no, not yet. Not yet. Oh.
Gotcha.
If you could give me any help, I would appreciate it.
Yep, I totally hear you on that. If I can find something, I will.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Question about the grant.
Yeah.
Is it only for community gardens or church gardens, or can family gardens do it?
It is for anybody in Michigan. I get that question all the time. I know it's well, not just in Michigan. It's a national program. So yes, it is not, though, and I feel like this is my fault. Keto and I, and T actually, and I think Ashley too, we work with NRCS to help people in Detroit and the Garden Resource Program apply for this grant opportunity. but it's not exclusive to people in the garden resource program or anything. It's just, I think NRCS recognized a need to have more people in urban environments, specifically Detroit, being able to like, you know, represent and speak to and assist people with the application process. So they reached out to KGD because we know a bunch of folks and we're out in community, right? But it's not specific to Keep Growing Detroit. We just happen to have the ability to do this and to help all people. So it's not specific. Obviously we love y'all and we like we are here for you, but if someone outside the garden resource program that was, you know, interested, technically they could call on us too to help them with their application. But really we're doing this work to help Detroit gardeners secure funding that you know, for reasons there have been in the past, you know, barriers, you know, for some of these like funding programs. So trying to help out. So no, if you're a community garden, school garden, market garden, it does not matter. I will say that I think the two things that are most important for the application process is that you have to have either own or have a lease agreement for the property where the high tunnel would go. And you also have to be currently growing crops in the area where the high tunnel would go. So if it's currently a vacant lot with nothing on it, you would have to be able to demonstrate like that you were growing something there this season. And two, you would have to be able to either own or prove that you have control over the property or access to that property in your application. So those are two big ones. I hope that answers your questions. Does anyone have any other questions?
Nope. Are we done?
Gotcha. Well, I wanted to share one more thing. We can be done. I just want to make sure. Keto left me with a whole bunch of. Can folks see this?
Excuse me. Yes.
Oh, you got a question? Okay. Okay, so this is another document that Keto's going to share with the notes. This is, we talked a lot about the fall, but we didn't necessarily talk about when to start early in the spring. So if you have cover, low tunnels, good mulching, a high tunnel, if that's the case, or like a cold frame, we're going to share this document with you. This shows you how early you can start things in the spring. So for example, in line 1, you can see, according to this document, you can plant out beets, like sow beets in the ground as early as, you know, February, March, if you want to. We give them a little bit of cover, but I feel like most folks don't know that like your season on the other side, you can plant a lot earlier than you think.
Oh, little tink tink. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Mute.
Oh, did somebody have a question? I heard some of that.
I'm sorry. I forgot that I was off mute, but I do have a quick question. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah.
I was talking to my husband. Anyway, the question that I have is, oh yeah, I called him Tink Tink. The question that I have is that I was reading online, like, you know, where we have potatoes growing right now, almost ready to harvest, that you could grow potatoes through the winter. Is that true or no?
You said potatoes, right? I was like, potatoes.
Yeah.
Potatoes. I have not tried that. Potatoes are really, if you don't get them out of the ground, potatoes are really susceptible to rot. So once the plant dies back, if the potatoes are left in the ground for too long, And especially here when we have kind of like wet winters, they can rot. So I haven't tried or had success with getting potatoes to overwinter. Um, that is something I have not heard before, actually. So I can't really
Okay.
speak to it. But I have left potatoes in too long in the fall
Wait.
and gone to dig them up after the plants died back, and they've been rotten in the ground.
Well, I
I
guess
might
what
have to.
I meant to say is not so much overwintering the ones that I already have growing, but like actually putting new seed potatoes in. But I was thinking the same thing, that they would rot through the winter here in Michigan, but I was reading that it was one of those vegetables that you can grow through the winter. I've never done it, but I was just wondering if you could. The other
Yeah.
question that I have
Okay.
is about garlic. So the first time I grew garlic was last year on a whim. I put my garlic, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
oh, yep, I can hear you.
Okay, so I put my garlic bulbs in last year in like July, and they did very well. Do you have to wait until, October to put them in?
Yeah, so the typical cadence, not the end all, well, here in Detroit and Michigan, the typical cadence with garlic is that you plant it in the very late fall, usually within 2 weeks of our first frost date. So like somewhere around Halloween, or like even last year we did the last week in November. Because the idea with seed garlic is that you put it in the ground and then it doesn't really have much of an opportunity to sprout before it sits. The idea is it sits dormant under the soil over the winter, and then takes advantage of those first couple of like warm days in the spring to really start growing, which means it's already in the ground when the soil starts to warm up, which means it gets the longest possible season. It is in and of itself, like the way we traditionally do garlic is a form of like season extension, strategic planning, in a way, because you're mulching it over the winter, you're putting it in well before, like the season starts, like the year before, and that gives it like the longest possible growing window, and that's really what you want. You want it to take advantage of like a very long spring, so that it can form the biggest possible head of garlic before it senesces, before it like ends its life cycle. And that typically that end
Well,
usually hits around the first or second week in July.
and so that's what I did. Like I had huge bulbs. The garlic was really wonderful, but I put
Awesome.
them in like late July last year, and I took them out in like maybe late, and they were so huge. And so
Nice.
but then I started reading like, okay, you really should wait until October, but they did well, so I guess it's not a problem. And this is the very last question. So from those
Sure.
garlic bulbs that did grow, right? I took like some of the
Yeah.
biggest bulbs, and
Yes.
they cured a couple weeks, and then I just put some back into my garden bed. Do
Yep.
they have? Do you have to let them cure before like replanting them, or no?
It's helpful. It's helpful because we
Yeah, well,
usually plant them. So if you're curing helps us get from July when we're digging them out of the ground to November when we're planting them. So that, like, what is it? August, September, October, like that 3.5 month waiting period, like really necessitates cure in order to like have them store until that time. It just like helps keep them until we end up planting it. So that's why the cure is important mostly for that, but also it helps to kind of like seal the paper wrapper around each clove and like dry it, and it to a certain degree helps prevent diseases from getting into the garlic when you're planting it. If you were to plant
Right.
green garlic, then it's nice and like raw still. There's a lot of opportunities for diseases to get in there. So a cure helps to like make that protective coating around the seed garlic.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Those were great ones. Any other questions, folks?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Because you say you call the clove part of the garlic the seed. When
Right.
when the garlic grows, now I was
Yeah.
told that was called the tooth, but when the garlic grows, there's this, it's something at the top.
Yeah.
I thought those were seeds. So can you plant those?
Yes, you can. That's fun. So there are 3 ways to propagate garlic. 2 of them are like, one of them is like used by most people. The other one is tricky, and another one is really just like for breeders, like people who are interested in developing new garlic strains. Number 1 is propagation by the cloves, and I say seed garlic. It's not true seed, but it's seed in that you're using it to seed next year's crop. So it's more of like a cultural term than an actual, in terms of botany, it's not accurate.
Okay.
So it's what you're putting in the ground is a clone of the mother plant. They're genetically identical. If you're planting with cloves off of the plants from this year. So that's number 1. That's the easiest way to do it. The second way to do it is to let it go to flower, and then you end up with that thing on the end that kind of looks like a flower with all of these little nubbies on it.
Right.
Yep. Those little nubbies are called bulbils, and they are also, I think, genetic clones of the mother plant. And if you plant each one of those teeny tiny little guys, you can get a head of garlic out of that plant, but it's going to take you 2 years to do it. So because they're so small. So you can put it in the ground. You'll get like something that looks a little bit like scallions, like in my experience in year 1. And in year 2, it'll get bigger, and then you'll get like a head of garlic out of it. Most people don't use those because it takes so much longer to get a full head of garlic out of it.
Okay, because I was told that if I planted those, I was told it took 3 years, but I was told that if I plant all those seeds and wait patiently, I would never have to plant garlic again.
Right.
So
they're not wrong.
So I was going to plant those plus some of the cloves. I was going to plant both of them and just see what happens. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, if you've got the space and time, I love it when people experiment with stuff like that. But yeah, it is. So 3 years, maybe 2 years, I was being a little like, 2 years. Yeah, 3 years sounds more accurate. It takes a long time to get it. For most people who are growing, I'm thinking like large scale growers, to have a single crop take up and it's a one-off crop, right? You get like one harvest off of a plant of garlic, like one head, right? For it to sit there for 3 years in a production space is usually like, it's too costly for a lot of people to go that route. So it's oftentimes like breeders, 1 or 2, like small scale growers who like think of that as an option at all. So I'm excited. Like, give it a shot.
Yeah, I'm gonna try it. But I figure I feel that the dirt is so rich in Detroit that I was hoping it'd take place in a year or 2. So
gotcha.
Right. Okay.
Well, you're gonna have to tell me how that goes, because I'm very interested in that now.
Okay.
That's cool. Cool. Any other questions?
Hi, it's Joy again. I do have another quick question. Will the slides
Sure.
from tonight be available?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. In addition to some like supplemental documents that Keto gave me that I wasn't able to open during the presentation. Yes.
Hi, Molly.
Hello.
Hi. I don't know if I missed it, but do you guys have a link for to get the high tunnel through the FDA?
I will
Do
have
you have the link for
Keto-
that? Or
I'm gonna ask Keto to add it to the notes. Yep.
okay, that'd be
Yeah,
great.
for
Thank
sure.
you.
Yeah, no problem.
I think this may be my year to apply.
No way. Seriously?
Yes, I
That's
think
awesome.
I am. Yes.
That's really cool. That's pretty neat. I'm glad to hear it.
Yep.
Cool.
I'm excited.
I will make sure. Yeah. No, I mean, that's an exciting thing. I mean, it is like, I don't know. It's exciting and a responsibility, and it's just, yeah, it's a whole different world. I would say.
Exactly.
Very cool. Very cool. Any other questions, folks? Keto, are you still with us? I see that he's still here, but, or at least he's still logged on. Well,
Thank you
folks,
so
if we
much,
don't
Molly.
yeah, if you don't have any more questions, I've run out of material, but I'll make sure that I pass along your request to Keto so that he can send them out with the notes. But thank you so much for being a part of class and for bearing with me
Thank you.
through technical difficulties.
Thank you for the good info.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
No problem at all.
All right, bye.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
evening.
Good night.